Welcome everyone to CVI Now's live virtual event all about CVI and communication with a focus on augmentative and alternative communication, AAC. If you are with us on our CVI Now parent group, drop a hello in the comments and feel free to post questions as they come to you. I am Rachel Bennett, the Content and Community Manager for CVINow.org, and I am a CVI mom. We know that our kids with CVI require life-changing access to thrive and reach their full potential in a world that is not designed for them. So thinking about our topic today, how does CVI impact the development of communication? And what are the implications for assessment and the development of a communication system that is individualized to a child's unique needs? Today we'll have a conversation with two incredible professionals who work with students with CVI that have a range of needs. We are so fortunate to have here with us Sylvia Mangan and Christopher Russell. Sylvia is a speech-language pathologist here at Perkins School for the Blind. Sylvia works with lower school students and has experience working with children with CVI and complex communication needs. Sylvia is in the second cohort of the UMass CVI Certification Graduate Program. Chris is the project coordinator at the New York Deaf-Blind Collaborative and a Perkins Roman CVI range endorsed TVI. Chris has a lot of experience working with children who have CVI and additional complexities, including deafblindness. Chris is a leading voice and educator in the CVI field. We'll begin with presentations from both Sylvia and Chris, and then afterwards they are here to answer your questions. Let's get started with Sylvia.
CVI, and what does AAC even stand for? We're going to run through some basic questions and some of the things that you might some of the factors you might consider when you're designing AAC systems for our wonderful, beautiful children with CVI. So what even is augmentative and alternative communication? So we all augment our speech naturally. Nothing in everyday conversation, nothing is just pure words. We use intonation and gestures and facial expressions and body language. And often we naturally choose alternative communication to verbal speech, especially in this age of technology. We have memes and emojis and GIFs. And so we often do our own alternative communication. But sometimes people with speech and language disorders need a way to augment their speech or need an alternative method for communication. And that's when we look at supporting with AAC. So what does AAC look like? There is such a wide spectrum. So I'm looking at it through the lens of how much technology is involved. First, there's no tech, right? We learn sign language. And the beautiful thing about sign language is that you can't forget your hands behind, and wherever you go, you have them with you. And so sign language can be a really beautiful portable thing. It can be a little tricky for people with vision impairment. Gestures and vocalizations are another way to communicate without any technology. And then we step into low tech. So this includes visual supports and pictures, sometimes tangible symbols, and symbol boards like the one on the bottom right here from BoardMaker. And we use AAC throughout the lifespan. So sometimes if someone's communicating as an adult who is literate and had a stroke and can't speak anymore, it can be as simple as a pen and paper. So mid-tech is where we start to mix in a little bit more technology. That's where we have the voice output switches like the Big Mac on the bottom left, some picture exchange communication books like the one in the center, and then leveled speech generating devices. And this is still low tech, but there's a lot of messages recorded on here in that Go Talk 9 in the right corner. And then sometimes we just pair pictures or tangible symbols that they learned in the low tech stage with voice output, which can provide some really wonderful modeling for our children. And then we step into high tech, and that's where you see more of those dedicated dynamic speech devices. These are your accents, your tablets. Sometimes we have tablets like iPads with communication apps. The one that's on the screen right now is ProLoquo to Go. And those communication apps can be used either visually or auditorily, or even with touch as a combination of things. So there's a lot of different ways to access these high-tech devices, and that can even include eye gaze devices, which we're seeing more and more development with eye gaze, and we're seeing it become more affordable and more portable as well. So there's some really incredible explosions of technology happening in the high-tech device industry. And we also see text-to-speech devices and apps, even opportunities for people to do Braille-to-speech if they're Braille learners. So as you can see, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Each person who uses AAC is unique, and their communication needs are unique. And so we have to work hard to find just the right system for each individual person. So how do you do that? How do you know what AAC system fits each person's unique needs? The answer is with a really thorough assessment. So as a speech pathologist, when I'm thinking about designing the right AAC system for a child, I need to get a really good grip on their language skills. How much can they understand? What's their listening comprehension, or what we call receptive language skills? Can they follow one-step directions? Would they be able to listen to an entire story and understand every word? And then we also look at their oral expression or expressive language. Are they verbal communicators? Are they expanding to sentences, or are they back at phrases? And would an AAC system help them build and expand to sentences? And then we look at how they use their language socially. It's what we call pragmatic language. And this is so critical when we think about embedding an AAC system in someone's life. We need to look first, how are they already engaging with their community, and how can we use that as a scaffold to build further, and with AAC be connected even more. And then we also need to look at their motor skills. Are there any motor planning challenges? And if they're a verbal communicator, is their motor speech impacted? Are they difficult to understand? And also, would they be able to navigate a high-tech device with their fingers, or would they need to do something that's a little more accessible, like switch scanning or eye gaze? So we need a complete picture of their motor profile as well. And then we need to look at their sensory profile. Is there any hearing impairment? Is there any vision impairment? And is touch a reliable means of gathering information for this person? So as you can see, there's a lot to look at. That's painting in broad strokes, but that's roughly the areas that we start with. We also need to keep in mind attention and memory, because this will factor into the complexity of the AAC system. And so we take all these pieces and we do something called feature matching. And that's integrating all of these factors and even more, as you'll hear as this presentation goes on, to identify appropriate systems for each individual. So we need to figure out what's the best support. And what kind of assessments do we use? Let's dive in. First, let me just say, this is a really small sampling of all the assessments that are out there. There are a lot of language assessments in the world of speech-language pathology. I've selected a few here that I'll explain a little later, are a little more accessible for anyone with a vision impairment, but just keep in mind, this is a small sample. So we look at receptive language, and for example, the PLS-5 has something called the auditory comprehension scale, and there are various subtests of others that listen to sentence comprehension and helps us see just how much grammar can they understand, do we need short, simple sentences, that kind of thing. And then to measure expressive language, we look at other subtests within those tests, and we can use more high-level social pragmatic language assessments like the social language development test, or they're often something called pragmatic subtests like in the Castle or the SELF. You might have heard of these assessments if you've been through the system. And we also need to look at their vocabulary, just how many words do they already know, and both can they understand and what they produce. And then we also look maybe at our total communicators using a more comprehensive perspective in one assessment. You're going to hear a lot more about the communication matrix today, so I'll try not to talk about it too much because Chris has a lot to say about it. And I'm so excited to hear from him about it. And we also look at the functional communication profile. And I do want to note that clinical observation is just a critical part of language assessment. We need to see the child operating everywhere, and we need to see how they're already communicating and use our clinical judgment there as well. And we might use a chart. This is from Boston Children's Hospital. There's something called a feature matching chart. If we're looking between different apps or systems, we might put it all into a chart and see how much can we customize it, what's the output, and how do we access it. And see, there's a lot of information going into this, and so sometimes we use something like this chart just to organize it all. So this is really why we're here. What kind of considerations do you make for assessing students with CVI? So to answer this question, I need to share some barriers that we have in assessing students with CVI. So many language assessments are highly visual. So much of communication is visual, and many of our tests reflect that. They often require students to scan multiple abstract pictures. Like in this example, there's 3 different dogs, and the child is expected to show us which one is the biggest, which this would be so difficult for many of our children with CVI for so many reasons. So a lot of our testing is not quite appropriate. And even tests without visuals have visual bias included, and they might rely on milestones that are only met with vision, like joint attention, where the child's looking at the bottle and you're looking at the bottle at the same time, and you both know you're thinking about the same thing. And also eye contact. And the higher level assessments may reference highly visual language or test the students' grasp of words that are more easily meaningful to individuals without a visual impairment. So unfortunately, we do have some barriers to any kind of standardized testing. But there are a limited number of assessments that were designed specifically for individuals with vision impairment, and they're mostly in the early intervention or early childhood arena. So there's something called the Raynell-Zankin scale from ages birth to 5, and the Oregon Project ages birth to 6. So we do have a couple tools in our pocket, but a lot of them are not perfectly designed for our children with CVI. Some of them are more appropriate, especially if you're thinking about total communication. Like I said, the communication matrix, it's a beautiful, beautiful tool. I rely on it so much. And one of the great features of it is that it's interview and observation based. So the parent and family interview plays a key role. And the functional communication profile also includes considerations for vision impairment and considers what's your optimal access method for AAC. Can you access it visually? Do you need to access it through touch? Are you more of an auditory learner? So I appreciate that about that assessment. And again, the family caregiver interview is a critical element with that assessment as well. And then other standardized assessments can be adapted. For example, the preschool language scale gives a really nice picture of general language development in early childhood. I wish it wasn't called preschool because it goes all the way through age 7. And we have in the past substituted real objects rather than picture easels, or you could target the skills listed on the scale with objects or materials that they're familiar with. It wouldn't be a standardized assessment at that point, but it would be really informative and give us a lot of great information. And portions of the Castle 2 are purely verbal and don't reference images. And then there's the language processing test, which is mostly verbal and has one subtest that we can use objects instead of pictures. So there are ways to work around it, but a lot of it ends up with testing that has tons of information for us, but it's not standardized. So the key to this whole puzzle is collaboration. The children that I work with who have CVI are so beautifully unique and complex that each one presents with a different skill set and array of strengths. And I really need my team in order to effectively design an AAC system that just fits each unique student. So let's talk about collaborators. Who are the key collaborators? So speech language pathologists, that's me, SLPs, since AAC is a communication system primarily, SLPs are kind of the team lead in this area in designing and implementing. We're the ones who craft the materials often, and we introduce them to them, and then we work with everyone to help them generalize the skills that they work hard in speech therapy to everywhere else. But families, you are the experts on your children, and I cannot overstate how important you are in this process of developing an AAC system for each child. We need your valuable information about how your child communicates throughout the week and everywhere, how they communicate in the playroom, in the grocery store. And we get to see your child for just a couple windows of time, and your interview is really critical. We also need the device to work with your home routine, and you're the constant in your child's life. And we know that we just need to work together to find something that can grow with your child. Teachers of the visually impaired, I love my TVIs. They're so incredible in all the information they can provide, especially when you're thinking about children with CVI. Their assessments and opinions are just invaluable. So as an SLP, I find it so helpful to dig through all the reports from the TVIs. One of the first ones I look for is the learning media assessment, because it's critical when we think about access method. Do we want to develop a system that is more auditory, where they listen and scan through options? Or is their vision at a point where we can rely on it for a communication system? Or are they more tactile learners? And then we can consider crafting a more tangible system. So TVI reports often encompass a lot of different assessments you may have heard of. The functional vision assessment, Dr. Roman Lancey's CVI range, Dr. Dutton's inventory, the TEACH CVI from Else Ordovist. Matt Tejan's work has been so critical. Yeah, there's multiple things on here, but they all file in with such really critical information. And that information, because each assessment is so helpful, I've put it more in sorted and organized it by information and category rather than by assessment. So I often look for information on impact of spacing or arrangement or clutter. So if using a visual AAC program, we need to think about how many icons can a child with CVI access visually. So are they maybe needing a more simple setup, like the one on the left, where there's 2 icons on the page? Or has their vision advanced to the point where they can handle a more complex array, like the one on the right? So I often look for that information about impact of spacing. We might also look at form accessibility. What kind of objects are visually accessible to this child? Do they need something in 3D? Or are they ready to move up to 2D? Do we need to keep objects one solid color like that bottle of bubbles? Or can we have more patterned or more colorful objects like the turtle on the right? Integration of competing sensory input is a really critical one for AAC, because often we expect children to look and listen at the same time. And so we need to think about, can this child tolerate sound while looking? And it's so important when developing a plan for actually using the materials. So if a child is using one sense at a time, I write a write-up for anyone who's working with them and say, like, for example, if we're talking about the student Jenny, I would say, show Jenny the wrapper snapper and let her look at it in silence for at least 10 seconds, then tell her what it is, say wrapper snapper, etc. So we need to think about what senses we're challenging with this AAC system and how orderly we can be with that. And I do want to just throw out some food for thought. If a child can't use their vision in a noisy environment, then how easily will they generalize their AAC beyond the therapy room? So we need to be thinking about having supplementary systems or just something in place so that when the child has maximum visual fatigue, that they're still able to communicate. We might also look at need for light. So I was working with a child who had a system recommended by an outside source who said to use just laminated pictures that were non-complex, like the one on the left. And so I was working with that, and for weeks, we weren't making any progress. And then his CVI reports from my TVIs came in, and they noted the need for light. And so I put it onto a backlit device, and it just made such a huge difference in his visual attention. So need for light is another key one to think through. And then Matt Tejan's work on access to images is so helpful for AAC design. This basically is looking at what kind of 2D images are children actually able to visually access? It's a lot easier to recognize a real photo of an object, especially when they're familiar with, than it would be to recognize a realistic, even with color, cartoon like the one after that. And you can see how it gets harder and harder to recognize as you move from left to right, that you start to rely more and more on the visual features of the item in question. And so it's so helpful to be able to look at this and assess really what is this child understanding and what would help them learn the system even faster. So there are so many other essential collaborators. OTs provide critical information about fine motor skills and sensory regulation. PTs are so helpful when we think about positioning and body mechanics. The classroom teacher is with the child all day, and so they can help us with some of the interviews, and they're so important in supporting the AACs throughout the day. Music therapists can be such wonderful creative partners in motivating and engaging children, and orientation and mobility specialists also provide really valuable insights into navigating the environment and still communicating. So in the short answer, we need everybody on board. So I know I'm way over my time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how we monitor progress. So there are regular progress reports from the IEP if your child is enrolled in a school that should report on specific objectives surrounding AAC use. And the SLP usually kind of quarterbacks the progress monitoring and usually checks in regularly with all the other team members to see how's it going? Do we need another in-service? Do we need to kind of troubleshoot this a little bit? We're always talking to our team. And additionally, some high-tech device users use online programs that kind of record every single button. And there's mixed feelings about this. Some people find it really helpful and others think it violates privacy and the water gets muddied whenever you're doing modeling on the device. So thank you so much for listening to this time. I can't wait to have more of a conversation about this. It's one of my favorite subjects.
Thank you, Sylvia, so much. Really, really appreciate that really thoughtful presentation and all of your insights. There's some questions coming in. We see your questions. We're going to hear from Chris so we can get a really dynamic conversation going on. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was amazing. I don't know how you just summarized so much comprehensive information in such a concise and articulate way. That was awesome. And I think that we're very much on the same page about a lot of this, so I'm excited to be in conversation with you. I want to thank Rachel for inviting me to do this today, and thanks to Sylvia as well for being in conversation with me. Thanks to Allie behind the scenes. I am just going to share my screen and pull up the presentation now. And this is sort of the 10 to 15 minute version of what really is more like a full day presentation. So excuse me if I'm sort of breezing through things. I just want to sort of scratch the surface of a very particular approach toward assessment and designing intervention for students with CVI. And in particular, these are considerations for designing expressive AAC programs. So Sylvia spoke a lot about sort of holistic and comprehensive assessment. I'm talking more specifically about design and implementation considerations for expressive AAC systems, expressive communication systems. I think especially for students who are pre-linguistic communicators or emerging linguistic communicators. And we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that. This is based on some work that I've been doing over the last year or more with the project coordinator of the Maryland Deafblind Project, Jen Willis, who is a teacher of deaf, hard of hearing. And we talked about sort of creating a comprehensive tool for supporting teams and families to be able to figure out what types of considerations and guidelines are necessary to ensure full accessibility as well as appropriate leveled communication. So I'll explain what I mean by all that. The reason for this work coming about is because in my role with the New York Deaf Blind Collaborative, I spent a lot of time sort of running around from school to school. I see a lot of different classrooms, a lot of different practices, and a lot of different students. And I was finding a common trend in the design and implementation of communication programs and systems, which I could only describe as significant mismatches between communication systems and the visual accessibility of those systems. So on the one hand, I was seeing communication that looked appropriate on a communication level, but it was visually inappropriate in terms of the CVI adaptations for that specific student. Or I was seeing the reverse, which was communication that looked great from a CVI perspective, but it was inappropriate in terms of the communication development of that student. And I mean their current expressive levels of communication, not what they understand receptively, but what they're currently doing expressively. So I was seeing this sort of off balance a lot. Some examples of that were a student who was in phase 1 of CVI, and the team was using an eye gaze system. I really don't think that there's any example where that would be appropriate. A child in phase 1 simply is not making eye to object contact and direct visual fixation. And so it would be impossible for that student to effectively use an eye gaze system. Okay, even if the eye gaze system may be appropriate on a communication level for that student, it was visually inaccessible. On the other hand, a student in phase 3 who had a complex 2D iPad system, you know, Proloquo to go or some other, you know, high-tech AAC program that looked fantastic from a visual perspective, and it was really well adapted for that student's visual needs in terms of phase 3 adaptations unique to that student, color highlighting, reduced complexity, looked beautiful. But the child was currently a pre-symbolic communicator and had no idea what any of those symbols meant, and wasn't using a single symbol, let alone an array of, you know, 30 to 40 symbols on a complex device. So this is this lack of balance, this sort of off balance where one thing looks good and the other thing doesn't really match. So my idea was what we really need in terms of like a holistic approach toward balancing communication and vision. Think of it as a balanced scale. On the one side, we are creating communication systems that are appropriate on a communication level in terms of the child's understanding of symbolism and use of symbols, or use of language, or use of other AAC modalities that are more behavioral or gestural or pre-symbolic. That's balanced with the sensory access piece, which is what is the student's specific need in terms of their CVI phase, the way that the characteristics impact them specifically, and then preferred learning channels. Like Sylvia was saying, the learning media assessment or sensory learning profile for the child with CVI is balanced in terms of what that student is, what that student needs in combination of visual input, auditory input, and tactile input. Now, the disclaimers on both sides are that on the communication side, we're still talking about multimodal communicators, students who use multiple modes of communication, and we're honoring the communication that that child has. In addition to scaffolding and building, you know, higher levels and forms of communication. And also, I really want to emphasize this, and I think this is important to the, you know, to honoring the work of speech pathologists, that we're still talking about providing a robust AAC program receptively. We're still providing access and exposure to language and modeling of the use of language, but we know that this child's not currently an expressive language communicator. So we need to meet that child where they are right now and help get them up to the next level in terms of their expressive communication. On the sensory side, we're still talking about multisensory access. That's what preferred learning channels is all about. The right combination of visual, auditory, and tactile, which may shift throughout the day and in different opportunities and different scenarios. And we're still talking about universal design, about providing access that's appropriate on a holistic level. So Sylvia already covered this, but this is the ASHA sort of, you know, statement about AAC to really emphasize that AAC, you know, I think often when you hear the term AAC, you often think of a high-tech device. AAC includes all forms of communication other than oral speech. So that includes gestures, facial expressions, it includes concrete symbols, pictures, writing, or any other kind of form of communication. So we do have multimodal communicators. We are all multimodal communicators who use different levels and forms all the time. Our students may use multiple modes simultaneously, or they may use them at different times of day for different purposes. Now, what's unique to CVI is that kids with CVI often shift modes based on multisensory complexity and the impact of visual and sensory fatigue. And so Sylvia talked about this a bit as well. You know, one example that I've seen is a student who did really, really well trialing an eye gaze device, you know, in a very contained, controlled setting. And it looked like, hey, wow, this might be a good mode of communication for this student. But that was in a controlled setting, in a quiet room, with the, you know, with the window shades drawn and no multisensory complexity. That same student in a busy classroom cannot access that eye gaze device at all because of all of the other multisensory input and noise. So we have to be thoughtful about the impact of fatigue and complexity. And our students may use multiple modes in the same setting. They may use different modes with different communication partners, with different people. So we need to be thoughtful about this and not just limit communication to one targeted system. A system should be sort of, robust and individualized to meet that student's multiple needs. Okay. So again, my own little disclaimer that I want to really emphasize is that I'm not talking about adapting, limiting the student based on their capabilities or what they understand receptively. We're still presuming competence. We're still providing exposure to language, but our students very often need scaffolding at their current levels of expressive communication. The first question I think you have to ask is, does this student have symbolism? And so if you have a child or a student who has language, yeah, they're way beyond the pre-symbolic level. A lot of the kids that I work with, especially in the field of deaf blindness and students who have CVI and multiple additional challenges, we need to understand, does the student have an understanding of symbolism? Symbolism is the understanding that a symbol refers to an event, activity, object, or person. In order to have symbolism, you need to have a symbol. In this case, we're using a concrete symbol, a bottle cap, a water bottle cap, which symbolizes water. So that's the symbol for water. It's not water itself. And we have a referent, which is what the symbol refers to. We're using a concrete symbol of a cap to refer to a water bottle that's a real thing that the student is going to use the cap to communicate about or to request. So does the student or child have this? We also need to be thoughtful about the level of iconicity. This is similar to what Sylvia brought up in talking about what's the complexity framework. How concrete or abstract visually, but also conceptually, are the symbols that we're using? We have three sort of primary stages, three main stages of iconicity, or the level to which a symbol is concrete and really resembles the thing that it closely resembles the thing it refers to, or abstract doesn't really resemble the thing that it refers to. So the first one is an icon. An icon has a very close resemblance to what it refers to. We're using a bottle or a cap to refer to water. Okay, very close resemblance, or a photo of that. An index would be the next stage in building complexity or abstractness. And we're seeing in the middle here a line drawing. This is one of those Mayor Johnson, PEC symbols for water. It's a little cartoon of a water faucet with the word water and a blue sort of shape coming down from it. And we can look at this and we can recognize all of the references. We go, oh yeah, that's a faucet. And I know that faucets can sometimes look like that, but faucets sometimes look different from that. And I know that that blue stuff coming out of there is water. But I think too often we assume that our children and our students understand those abstract concepts when they have no experience with all of those references and connections. The most abstract icon, the most abstract form of a symbol is a true abstract symbol. So if you haven't figured out what this is yet, on the bottom right, this is a diagram of the actual molecules for water, right? The H2O, the big oxygen molecule, and the two little hydrogen molecules. I think it's fair to say that none of us would ever use this as a symbol on a student's device or a student's communication plan for water. It's so abstract, it's way beyond any real close connection. So we would never use that extremely abstract symbol, but how often do we use the one in the middle? And we make assumptions about the connections and the experiences that the student has. In the case of CVI, the visual experiences that they have. So this is what I think Matt Tejan's What's the Complexity framework is really all about. It's about understanding that experience is extremely important to the symbols that we use and the way that we show 2D information. Is this your child's experience with water? Or is it this? Or is it this one, a paper cup? Or is it a water fountain? And that's about novelty, right? The characteristic of CVI, that iconicity of a symbol is like novelty. It's relative to individual experience. So we need to be very thoughtful about what is your child's individual experience. That's what we're going to use to help start to select symbols for communication, whether they're 3D symbols or 2D symbols? Can your child look at something that's relatively new and they haven't seen before and make the connections to fit it into the category and understand that's what it is? Okay, so the tool that we made, that Jen from Maryland and I made over the last year or so, is basically breaking down by each phase of CVI. What are the considerations for AAC systems, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3? And we actually broke up phase 2 into early phase 2 and late phase 2 because there's a very big difference between the two. And what we've done is we've created sort of these little, you have little boxes you can sort of tick off if those considerations are relevant to your child. Whether your child's an emerging pre-symbolic communicator, meaning that they communicate mostly through behaviors, or are they concrete? They're using symbols and photos or line drawings, or are they an abstract communicator who communicates through abstract symbols and words? So you want to align, just with the balance scale, you want to align your child's communication level with their CVI phase. So here's phase 1, right? And phase 2. So if your child's a phase 2 concrete communicator, you would look in that column and you'd sort of look down the guidelines and just tick off which ones are most important to your child. And you'd work with the speech pathologist to figure out how to adapt a meaningful system based on those guidelines. Okay, so late phase 2 and phase 3 and so on. I want to show you just a short little video, and I'm not going to take too much time. This is an example that I like to show because I think it shows a balance between CVI adaptations and communication level adaptations. And it's just about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes long. And this is a speech pathologist who's working with a young girl with CVI who also has a cochlear implant and is, in that way would be considered a student who's deafblind. She has, at the time of this video, emerging symbolic communication language. She understands what these symbols mean, but she's still communicating expressively through a lot of gestures, behaviors, pre-symbolic modes, and she's using these symbols, these tangible, concrete objects, in order to talk about the events in her day, okay, and scaffolding communication. So what we're looking for here is what's that sort of balance between CVI adaptations and communication level adaptations that are multimodal and consider her access and exposure to language, but also the scaffolding that she needs to get to that next place expressively. Okay, here we go.
Yes. There's okay. Look. Is there? She's still here, but we'll do it for now. Over. Okay. Your book is all done. Hmm? Yes. Okay, Maeve. Now it's time for speech. Flip it over. Speech. Hmm? And then morning meeting. Then, Miss Becky, what's after morning meeting? And then drink. Okay. Yes, it's time for speech right now. Are you ready? Let's go.
Okay, so back to this. Okay, so looking for the CVI adaptations, first we're seeing that she's using partial objects. They're not yet 2D because at the time of this video, she still wasn't quite ready for using two-dimensional photos or, flat 2D symbols to communicate. There's a black backdrop to reduce visual clutter. Also notice that the black backdrop is at eye level against the wall. And when I was taking this video, I really wish that just for a second I had turned the camera to the left, because what you would have seen is a very busy, visually busy classroom. And even just the choice to have the board in that specific location is a CVI adaptation. She's positioned with her back to the busy information. There's also the red rectangle that highlights what we're doing now. So we're actually making a concept point there. And there's a red tape around the rim of the finish box because often kids with CVI have difficulty with their lower visual field. So that red electrical tape helps make that information in her lower visual field kind of pop out. On the communication level, we're using concrete, tangible symbols to develop symbolism and language. We're modeling visual sign with tactile modifications, right? So she's getting some visual signs, but she also is looking for that tactile support because she's still developing her vision. And she used to be, as she was developing much before, when she was in phase 1 and early phase 2, she was really a tactile sign language communicator receptively. The speech pathologist is also using constant physical contact and tactile support, as well as speech and audition. She has cochlear implant and some access to auditory information, and also the wait time and even just the clarity and the simplicity of the speech and the specific language that she's using is a communication level adaptation. So we want systems that can grow with the child, that can progress from 3D to 2D, from pre-symbolic to symbolic, and on into developing complex language. This student, once she actually got to the point within 6-8 months after this video was taken, where she could handle 2D information, we didn't want to lose the great communication that she had built with using these tangible symbols. So we converted them to 2D symbols, taking photos of them, mounting them on a black background, and her communication board is getting bigger and more expansive at the same time that her vision is growing. Her expressive communication is growing. She can handle more symbols in that array. And eventually, we're transitioning that into a 2D iPad system for more complex language and communication that can really develop into a more dynamic AAC program for her. Just don't forget about visual fields. You see that little picture on the bottom right side? She does a lot better if the communication board is lifted up a little bit in her visual fields. And eventually, this is where we're hoping it'll go, into a much more, we'll start to substitute those 2D symbols, photos, into sight words with bubbling, with specific color use to highlight specific words and make them pop out. And we're gonna start to build a more complex array over time. Another great idea that I've gotten from speech pathologists is to make a little cutout window just on a little popsicle stick that you can do partner assisted scanning to actually hover over a symbol and cut a hole out in the middle of that so the student can touch the symbol in between it, right? And eventually we're working on building a more dynamic system like this one, which was designed by a parent of a child with CVI and has a great website, cviSpeakAAC.com. Combination of photos of real things and starting to integrate sight words. That's it for me. Sorry, I went a little bit over too, but it was, I hope that was helpful, a little bit of a whirlwind tour, and looking forward to chatting with Sylvia now.
Oh my God, that was so wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sylvia. We have a lot of questions coming in, so should we just dive in? So let's see. The first question I want to address is, what's the recommended age to introduce AAC to a kid with CVI?
That's a great question. And I hate to say it depends, but it does depend. Some of it depends on their early development and how far they've gotten already. So it's really hard to say exactly just how early you can start. So I would consult with your TVIs and SLPs and say, is it an appropriate time and how early can we get this going? Because it does end up really helping our children.
Yeah, definitely. The only thing I would add to, I totally agree. The only thing I would add to it is remember, AAC isn't just high tech. So I think that it sounds like the question might be geared towards the assumption of, when do we get started with high tech AAC, which may not be necessarily as early depending on the student. But AAC is gestures and behaviors too, right? And facial expressions. So AAC starts at birth. But scaffolding and building AAC is a more individualized process.
Yeah, I totally agree. Our children are total communicators. We're total communicators. We use everything to communicate. And so appreciating and reinforcing whenever your children make any kind of communication, whether it's behavior or gesture or voice, that's laying the foundation.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Next question. If a child has a hard time with complexity and can't interpret more than a couple of words in an array, how do you build communication with AAC?
That's a good question. Well, there's a lot to AAC that includes vision, but also goes beyond it. So with AAC, you have the benefit of a lot of repetition, and often there's visual and auditory that's supporting it. There's motor planning. I've seen a child who I'm not sure is really visually accessing the screen, but has been exposed to it so much and knows exactly the order and the location of the buttons to hit it. So again, it does kind of depend on their own unique profile, but it's worth trialing things and seeing what is successful for this child, and is their motor planning at a place where maybe that's going to support them through this, or their visual memory for location of things on the screen, maybe will that support them more. But I really end up deferring to the TVI's recommendation of what is going to be accessible in the long run. Because often when we do team up like that, we see systems that lead to growth that is quicker because it's more accessible.
Yeah, I totally. And I think also, in general, instead of thinking about limiting the array on a device or a communication board, instead of limiting the array, limit the amount of things that are shown on the array. So, if you can have you can have a device and an array that has 3 rows of 4 symbols, 12 symbols in total, but only 3 of them are shown. The rest of them are masked. And that allows you to build it over time. Your student's not ready for 12 at a time, but maybe they're ready for 3. Rather than giving them a board that has 3 giant symbols, give them that board that eventually will have 12, and it has those 3. Remember, CVI has nothing to do with the size of visuals. It just has to do with the complexity of the array of visuals. So it's okay if it's a small icon, as long as it really stands out visually and it's visually distinct and well spaced out from the other icons. So consider not setting limitations from the start. And you always want to go with the biggest array possible, just with the appropriate amount masked.
Yeah, and I would highlight that word masking, that if you're going to talk to your speech pathologist about that, that's the key word to use there. Maybe starting with more masked and then moving beyond.
Is masking just putting up, cut out piece of paper with a different, or is there like
it can be
a little more?
Yeah, that's a low tech way of doing it. But there's most of the high tech devices offer ways to digitally mask them. So you only show 1 button on the array, or 2 or 3, and you can program it that way. So,
and then when you start removing pieces of the mask to reveal more, but the words will stay in the same place, so it both supports visual attention recognition and visual memory.
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I'm figuring out. So a big question about why use pictures instead of words when setting up the AAC symbols? Wouldn't that be so much easier for the child? Not doing that reinforces the idea of kids are not being able of learning to read. Pictures are so difficult, and I feel that words can be really good for our kids.
Yeah, I mean, like Actually, sight words are visually less complex than photographs. So that's what I mean about that balance between what you're showing a student and what they're expressively using. So I think the real consideration in using sight words or photographs is that sight words are visually better. They're more visually simple than a complex photograph, most complex photographs. But sight words are more conceptually abstract than photographs. So a word is a true abstract symbol, just like that H2O molecule. That's what a word looks like for a student who doesn't know what the word is or doesn't know that a word represents a thing. So if your child doesn't yet know that a word can represent a thing, then using sight words is going to be way too conceptually abstract, and then you should use a photograph of a real thing. But if your student knows that words can represent things, then by all means use sight words. And that picture, the example I showed of the array that has a lot of sight words on it, you can use different colors to emphasize different sight words so that it doesn't get too complex. You know, having a screen with 15 sight words all with red bubbling, that looks a little crazy. But if you have different colors for them, you're emphasizing different colors for different categories too.
I'd agree. Yeah, words are really, sight words can be highly symbolic, and we just want to make sure our kids understand them and can have those foundational skills first, just like Chris said. And I do want to point to that we really do need to be using color in a way that supports our children. And if everything's red, then it all kind of looks the same. So being intentional with our choices of color coding is really critical. And we need to make sure that they're actually able to tie this to their life and to their experience. So that's where often the photos of objects in their environment, it bridges the gap a lot more easily.
So then once they really, they recognize that 2D picture of something in their life, and then they learn the word, then would you replace the word with that picture on their AAC device, for example?
I'm hesitant just because I think I work closely with the CVI on that just to make sure, is a sight word going to be something that's visually accessible to them?
Right.
And is that something, are they able to do the horizontal tracking that you need to do to like read words and track across a word? And so I think some of it does really depend on the child. And so I just get nervous if we say a one size fits all CVI.
No, definitely not.
I know you're not saying, but
yeah,
that's one thing I'd just like to.
That's great. Thank you. So related to literacy here, how have you incorporated AAC in literacy for kids with CVI? It's a great question.
Good question.
Yeah, that's a hot topic. Well, there's a lot of ways to start. Sometimes with my complex communicators who are maybe a little earlier on in their language development, I think some of the best literacy has to be tied to their life. And so I would start with a social experience story about one of their routines. Like on Tuesdays, I go swimming and we have their swimming towel and their swimsuit. And we talk about where they go and the sequence of events. And that helps them with novelty when they get there because they've talked it through so many times. And it also gets them used to the flow of a narrative of a story. And remember, AAC is everything. It's gesture, it's intonation, it's interacting with real objects. So that interaction with those, what we would call a story box of objects, lays a really great foundation that maybe if they've interacted with that so much, that we can use that object as part of their communication system, or we could take a picture of it down the road to represent swimming or any number of things. So that's one way to get started, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add to that. I guess the only other thing that's perfect. And I would totally emphasize experience books and, you know, and integrating familiar and meaningful experiences into literacy and simultaneously using AAC and modeling AAC in those activities. The only other thing it made me think of too is, you know, remember that literacy is encoding and decoding, and encoding is writing and decoding is really reading or listening. And kids with CVI, because of their challenges with sensory complexity, encoding and decoding might actually occur in different formats, and even decoding reading and listening may occur in different formats too. So, I've seen a lot of students whose listening comprehension is way higher in terms of grade level than their ability to decode words, sight words, and to read letters. And it has nothing to do with their cognition. It's purely because with CVI, it's very hard to decode sight words and letters if you're not at a certain point in your visual skills and behaviors, right? And your processing. And so in those cases, you might have a student who's working on literally just understanding the shapes of letters and beginning to compare and contrast visually to break down and identify and recognize and discriminate letters and numbers. But on a listening comprehension level, that student is on grade level, a fourth grader, listening to stories and understanding them. And if that's the case during the listening experiences, limit the visual demands. Do not make listening a multisensory experience. Make it purely listening. No visuals required, because otherwise you're just wearing the student out and you're expecting them to listen and look at the same time. You're going to lose some of the listening. And on the other hand, with the decoding, make it purely a visual experience without a lot of multisensory listen and look at the same time. So that's what sensory balance is all about. And that's why, the sort of CVI version of the learning media assessment is so important to a communication and academic plan. Finding out, when to listen, when to look, when to expect both, and when some tactile information is needed too.
Absolutely. And if I could add one more thing, there's also some really great pre-literacy skills that you can start targeting if you're not at that point of decoding, even just getting practice interacting with a book, and obviously being mindful of how complex the pictures are and how saturated, but also you could start incorporating switch use if a child is using a voice output switch. Some rhyming fun books have a lot of repeating lines, and you can record it on the switch and have your child listen and pause right before the repeating line and let them hit the switch and participate with reading and have this really fun reciprocal literacy experience of participating with the book. Or you could just record, turn the page on the switch so that you let them tell you and have some control over over the pace of the story. So just a couple ideas.
That's awesome.
I love that. Building that sense of self-efficacy through the literacy process. Oh, this is all giving me chills. This is great. Would sight words be better for verbs rather than index stick symbols? It's a tongue twister. Did you get that? Do I need to repeat it?
Could you repeat?
Yeah. Let me try to speak better here. Would sight words be better for verbs rather than index stick symbols?
Oh, I think you're talking about like Mayor Johnson line drawings, like the little stick figures, those little guys.
I think so.
I mean, from a vision perspective, definitely. Sight words are way less visually complex, and they're also less conceptually complex than little stick figures. I think those PEC symbols and Mayor Johnson symbols that are, those little line drawings and little stick figures, they're designed for kids with autism, and they really are. It's a completely different process of language development and social use of communication. And assuming that those are just going to translate to kids with visual issues is a bad assumption.
Yeah, we need a lot more research in this area. To be honest, this is something that I'd love to see more research in, what is effective. And we have a lot of research behind the AAC systems, especially in the population of children with autism. But we need more with our kids with CVI.
We need a lot more research. I agree. Okay, next question. With CVI, how do you determine where to put the device and where to put the switch? My son uses his vision looking to the side, not straight forward. Great question.
Yeah, we got to take their visual fields into account. We need to figure out where the best optimal mounting, what is their strongest area in their visual field. And I would say there are times when the switch doesn't have to be in the visual field if it's a switch hooked up to a device. If a child is able to associate hitting the switch with what he's selecting on the screen, then you can have the switch mounted where it's more accessible from a motor perspective, from their reaching. Yeah, it does. You just need to take into account what is the strongest visual field, and then work with the PTs and the OTs and get it mounted in just the right way so the body mechanics are helpful and can grow with the child.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that, what you just said, Sylvia, too, it reemphasizes your big point in your presentation about why collaboration across disciplines is so critical in this work, that it's really not just the role of one or two people, it's the whole team that fits these pieces together. And that question reminded me of a student who I saw recently during an AAC assessment, and I was sort of like trying to help the team piece all of the disciplines together and consider all the factors. And the student had a strong right visual field preference, needed things to be up in his, upper to central visual field, but didn't have the motoric skills to reach there. And, was only able to really reach for something down here because of his low muscle tone. He was able to use his hand to activate something on the table, but wasn't able to see something that's down on the table. So he needed his device to be up here, centrally on his right side with a stand, with a gooseneck clip or stand. And he needed a switch, like a little Big Mac switch that was connected to it to be able to, I don't know the word, Sylvia, it's like a total speech term for like, it's not partner assisted scanning, but it's when the student themselves scans the device by selecting, press the button to go to the next symbol, and then press it again to select the symbol.
Would it be visual scanning or auditory scanning? Like, is he listening, or?
I guess it's visual scanning. Yeah.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
like on Zoom here, like when you're talking, you have a little outline around the person who's talking.
Mm-hmm.
So when you press the switch, it goes from icon to icon with a little hovering highlighter, and he presses it again to select the one that he wants.
That's really cool.
That's a great example that the whole child needs to be evaluated to find the best communication system. That's wonderful. There's some questions that were submitted earlier. So when do eye gaze devices become a viable option for individuals with CVI? Is there a better time to introduce it? How could eye gaze be modified to be more successful? A bunch of big questions there.
There's a lot there, right? We need to make sure that the child is able to recognize what they're seeing. So like Chris was saying in his presentation, phase 1, that's probably not appropriate if they're not having that eye to object contact. So I think it can be a really useful tool to help build those skills, and it can be something that's developed over time. But I would need to see some really good, strong visual skills, maybe late phase 2, early phase 3. I don't want to put a strict number on it before I would say this is their communication system, because of the factors that Chris talked about, of saying they can do this in a pristine environment, but as soon as you take them into the grocery store, forget about it. They're not going to be able to actually access their voice. So having access to the voice at all times, we carry our voice with us, and our kids need to be able to have that access too. So I'll defer to Chris on this one too, because I think he's done some good work with it.
No, I think you said it all. I don't think, I wouldn't add anything to that. There's not a hard number, but you do just have to be thoughtful about, whether the student's ready to use that in different environments. I guess the number one consideration to it even being a remotely appropriate system is the student currently making eye to object contact, which is, direct visual fixation, looking right at something. If they're still kind of doing that, looking past or through, kind of like to the left or over or to the right, and not directly at something, then there's just no way that it's an appropriate system.
Mm-hmm. And I'd agree that with a lot of our eye gaze systems, you also need to be able to sustain it for a little while, because you have to kind of lock in for a couple seconds at least to really make sure that the system picks up the reading of your eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. A specific question about just visual presentation. What's the rationale behind having a white background versus a black background for 3D or 2D symbols? Are the two background colors interchangeable?
So I see this as a question of contrast. Some of our students with CVI need high contrast materials, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why we see a lot of things that are black and painted black backgrounds, and That can be really helpful. But just remember that black is not high contrast for everything. And sometimes you need a white background to be high contrast with something that's gray or black even, or, you know, the darker colors. So there isn't one rule, like it doesn't all have to be black. But whatever your child needs in terms of contrast just needs to be considered.
Yeah, I agree. And the only thing to add to it is that, remember with CVI, it's not exactly about contrast, it's more about complexity. And so a black background reduces complexity. Contrast is good for everyone though, right? Contrast is universal design. And one of the reasons that contrast is universal design is that contrast reduces fatigue, visual fatigue. That's why your phone has an option on it, or your computer has an option on it, and your accessibility features to do reverse contrast. So you have a black background with white text, coming up rather than a white background with black text. The reason for that is that it actually reduces your visual fatigue. For all of us who, in remote, social distancing time spend so much of our day staring at screens, your eyes start to hurt after looking at screens for all day and you get a headache. If you change to do reverse contrast, which I'm being hypocritical because I still haven't done it myself, but it would actually help your fatigue. It would reduce your fatigue to have a black background with white text.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Chris, there's a question about your CVI AAC matrix. I know you're still in the process of working on it. Is it going to be coming out soon for parents who are interested in looking at it?
Yeah, I think it's done. The only issue was accessibility for screen readers and stuff like that. I didn't want to put something out there that was like not going to be accessible. Right. So I put all the alt text, like text descriptions on top of the photos. And I think it's ready to go. So, I haven't like posted it anywhere, but I can send it to you, Rachel, if you want to throw it up on the site.
Absolutely.
We were talking about printing it into like a nice little booklet at some point, but for now, you can have it digitally. And, my hope is that it's not like too much information. So please do, it says final draft, but there's no such thing as final draft. I'm happy to change it and, clarify things if there's anything that's not clear. So I would definitely appreciate feedback on it too.
Great. Yeah, when this recording of this event goes up, we'll include your link as well to the matrix. So you have a lot of great context with it. Just going to do a final call for any final questions. Doesn't look like anything else is coming through, and we are over time. I just looked at the time for the first time. So thank you so much, Chris and Sylvia. This has been wonderful to have you. Thanks for sharing your brilliance and your insights and answering, parent-specific questions. This is a really important topic to so many families. And so we really thank you for all you're doing for our kids with CVI and helping them find their voice and their full potential. So really, really grateful for you. This recording will go up on cvinow.org along with some further content about CVI and communication. So stay tuned for that. Everyone have a great evening and be well. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Sylvia. And thank you to Ali too.
Thank you.
This has been wonderful.
It's awesome.
Thank you so much for watching this event brought to you by CVI Now here at Perkins School for the Blind. Go to cvinow.org to learn more.